So today is May 13th, 2022. My name is Kevin Chen, and I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. Today, I'll be talking with Helen Sung, who's an accomplished jazz musician and composer, who is also a native Houstonian. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk with me today.
My pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
So we'll start off with a few questions about your early musical experiences, um, and I guess some of your early experiences in general. So as a native Houstonian, can you tell us where in Houston you were born and kind of the area in Houston you grew up in?
I was born in Herman Hospital, and I guess it's down part of the downtown medical center. And my dad actually relocated us briefly to Columbus, Ohio, where he got his doctorate in civil engineering. I'm the oldest of four, so my sister and brother were both born in Columbus, and I guess that's where I had my earliest memory of anything music related because um, this red toy piano, this plastic piano about this long, electronic thing uh, with about 13 keys. And I remember they were multicolored. And at that point, my sister and I are very close in age. Like, I think we're separated by like 16 months. So I don't know if it was meant for me or for both of us, but I remember I just took it under my arm and I'd walk around with it. And I don't really remember playing on it, but my mother said she heard me play melodies I heard off the radio and TV. So when they moved back to Houston and were looking for a house, they had some friends who were moving back to Taiwan, where my parents grew up, uh, who needed to get rid of a upright piano, upright Yamaha piano. And so my parents, according to what they said, well, this seems to be something I showed interest in. So um, they bought it from them. They said it was the first thing to be delivered to the house before a piece of furniture. And so then I started piano and violin around the same time in kindergarten. I went to Longfellow Elementary School, which is in the southwest part of Houston, right at the corner of the loop, right inside the loop. And I was really lucky. I went to public school from kindergarten through high school, but just really good schools with really good magnet programs that had great arts programs in them. And yeah, I had already learned to read music by the time I started violin. It was very much around the same time because in school they taught violin in this with the Suzuki method, which is all about learning by ear. But I had already learned to read music by then, so that kind of I missed that part of that training. Um, but I just remember we were all standing on stage at my elementary school playing Mississippi Stop Stop together, on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Anybody who's taken Suzuki violin will know what I'm talking about. And I don't remember verbalizing this, but I remember the feeling so clearly that it was a, it was almost like deja vu. Like I know how this works. I know how this thing works, even though I didn't know anything. So I must have been thinking about the music rather than maybe the technical parts, but just something about this sense of familiar familiarity and understanding, which is kind of cool, to be that young. So those were like my earliest experiences.
It's very impressive that, at such a young age you were able to, replicate melodies on that. Um,
Oh,
yeah.
well, I don't remember doing that, but so I hope my mom's not making
Through
that
your
up.
tall. um, Speaking of, your early musical education, some of your early musical experiences, um, you're classically trained when it comes to piano and violin before you branched off into jazz, later on. Do you remember your first, I guess, piano or violin teacher or teachers and kind of their influence they had on you?
Oh, I remember them all. My very first lady teacher was a lady. I won't say her name because it wasn't a good experience. Because I was like 5, and I remember she was she was an odd person. Her house, I remember going, it was all dark with just a lamp on the piano, just illuminating that space. And I'm probably making even more than it was, but like she wouldn't let my parents come inside. Like they had to sit on the porch, her outside porch, which in Houston is not that great sometimes because, you know, it's so hot and humid. Um, so that was very short lived. And then a friend, a family friend, introduced us to a woman who lived in the neighborhood, Miss Elizabeth Woodman, and she was an older lady, but she was a fantastic teacher. Like I don't think I failed to appreciate just how good she was. I didn't know, you know, I was just learning the piano, but just now that I've lived this life and had gotten experience, just she really put together, gave me a solid technical foundation. And she was so different from my next piano teacher who I started with. I started at age 5 with Mrs. Woodman, and then at age 9, she said, you know, you need a teacher who's going to take you on to the next phase. And a Russian teacher from the Russian school, uh, Miss Gilmson, Sophia Gilmson, and that was during my very formative years as an individual, and it was tough. You know, the the musicians of the Russian school, they're very proud, and you know, justifiably so, of their tradition. They have incredible tradition. They have all these incredible musicians and pianists, right, through history. People like Horowitz and Rachmaninoff and all those folks, just from that lineage. But it was also a very controlling, very just incredibly intense. Anybody who's taken lessons with a Russian teacher, I think, will be able to relate. And just kind of, for me, you know, being Chinese American, raised in a Chinese household, even though my parents were not that traditional, I think being a musician is all about uh, finding your voice as an artist. And what I mean by that is, what is it that you want to communicate to the world through your music? Who are you as an artist? Your sound, your style. And I think that typical Asian culture, it's not about having a personal voice. That's definitely not a priority. It's about obedience, dutifulness, uh, you know, reverence for your elders, not bringing shame to your family, not making way, you know, not causing any embarrassment. So just being really, I don't know, I don't even know what the word is. Just all I can describe is as not having a voice. And same with this Russian teacher. You know, she was very incredibly opinionated, and you know, it was like a perfect storm because you know we reverence our teachers, we don't question them, we revere them, and I revered her, and I wanted her approval so bad. You know, I was 9 years old, going into adolescence, and uh, it was her way or the highway. Like her way of interpreting music. This is how you're going to play it. Never letting me have a say or have an opinion about anything. And if I dared to offer something, it was not good enough. It was inferior. It was defective in some way. And there are things that you will never get. You just have to listen to me. So that was unfortunate. I think what I learned most from her was having a good practice regimen, so technical stuff. But in terms of being an artist, I felt like that really suffered under her regime. And you know, she also said the only real music is classical music and everything else is rubbish. So, you know, I remember I had a friend who was a year ahead of me who also studied with her, and she was a little more brave than me. And we'd go listen to like Madonna and Michael Jackson, and we, you know, we get in trouble for that. And just looking back, I wish I had rebelled, you know, but I didn't. So that was just, you know, she had me so locked up, just it was tough because, you know, I'm already a perfectionist to begin with and not wanting just to be approved of, you know, and just it was like a really not good situation, although I didn't realize it then. I only really had one violin teacher. Her name's Mary Fulgham, and she was like the complete opposite of this piano teacher. She's so nice and supportive, um, incredibly kind woman. I felt like she was too kind. you know, and she had wanted to pass me on to a teacher who was at that time teaching all the best violinists in Houston. Her name is Friedel Lack. She taught at, I think it was University of Houston. Maybe it was Rice. I'm not quite sure. But it's so funny. Like at certain points in my life, people ask me questions, and I just answer honestly, and it kind of sets me on this road. And I think I kind of disappointed my violin teacher because, you know, I played for this teacher, and she said to me, you know, she asked me different questions, and do you want to be a professional violinist? And I was like, I don't know. Because, you know, I really loved playing the piano too. And I always felt like I was better at the piano because I never felt quite physically comfortable on the violin. Like, I don't think I had the best technical setup. And maybe that's why Mary Fulgham wanted to pass me on to Miss Lack. Because actually, that's right. Miss Fulgham was actually a violist, but you know, it's not that different. But so when Miss Lack heard me say that, she was like, well, you know, I only take students that want to become violinists. And I was like, okay. And you know, I was young. I think I was in middle school when this happened. And I remember going down the elevator. You know, Miss Fulgham was too kind to say anything, but I could feel she was kind of looking at me like wondering why I said that. But, you know, it was honest and it was true. I wasn't sure. You know, even I played violin all the way up through end of high school, and even then I wasn't sure. But I decided to go with piano because I just felt more confident, more comfortable on the instrument. So
Wow, that's quite a history of teachers. And you know, you mentioned under the regime of your Russian piano teacher, how you're kind of like limited in a sense. You know, there's that sense of like obedience. So I'm just curious, when did you, I guess, um, break free from that obedience or realize that, oh, like this is not, you know, what I have to do?
yeah, another thing is I feel like teachers from the Russian schools, they pride themselves on being what they would call brutally honest, right? They would say sometimes really hurtful things that um, which I think I wish they would appreciate more just how powerful words can be. You know, whoever said sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me are so wrong because the damage that can cause sometimes cannot, it's like it takes much longer to heal. So, so I was like, I felt like I was under this burden I didn't even know because that's all I knew, you know? So I thought that's what life was. But you know, it's so funny. I went to the famous Performing Arts High School in Houston, HSPVA, and thought I wanted to go to a fancy conservatory because that's what you did, you know, if you're a music major. And I applied to several and got in, but unfortunately, financially, it was beyond what my family was able to do. And you know, I remember my dad said, "I'm not going to go into debt for an undergraduate education for, you know, especially when he didn't want me to be a musician in the first place, you know, oldest of four." So I ended up having to go to my backup school, which was UT Austin. And I remember feeling so devastated and so ashamed and just like no interest and enthusiasm. I was like going through the motions. But you know, over time, I just, you know, okay, I'm here, so I got to do this. And but now I'm so grateful because I know if I hadn't gone to UT, I would have never been exposed to jazz music. And it's very ironic because, HSPVA has an incredible jazz department, but I was so like this, with that classical. I never checked them out, which is so stupid in retrospect. Like, you know, and it's a shame. I think back to why did I not? And I think part of it was just just the, I mean, brainwashing maybe is too strong of a word, but just that stuff that my classical teacher, that Russian classical teacher, had been training me in, right? How to think about music and what was music, what was real, what was not. And then I have to admit, I think a large part of it was just insecurity, because I remember thinking, how do you make music without music on the on the piano, and how do you improvise? And it's just too bad that I went the opposite direction, that I didn't check them out. But at UT, it's funny how it happened. So this same friend of mine that I mentioned, who was a little more brave, she also was at UT, and we both studied with the same teacher, Nancy Garrett, uh, who was a who's a wonderful teacher. Very warm, very nurturing. Which, it's so funny. I was like, part of me was like, no, you need to be more mean and all that, because that's what I knew. I thought that was good piano teaching, right? But I think that's really what I needed. It just took some time to really kind of open up to that. And so I've told this story several times, but it's fun, so I'll repeat it. So my friend, her name is Christine Chang, and she one night came into the practice room. We were always practicing, like classical pianists do. And she said, let's go hear Harry Connick Jr. He's coming to town. And I remember asking her, who's Harry Connick Jr.? Because I wasn't very curious in my listening. I just listened to what I had to listen to. And she says, don't worry, Helen. He's hot. You'll like him. So I said, okay. So we went, and she was right. Very handsome, incredibly charismatic. He had his big band, and he was singing, and they were very entertaining. But what really got me was, in the middle of the concert, he sat down and played some solo piano. And I remember feeling like I'd been struck by lightning. Like, first of all, how come no one told me about this? And second, I didn't know you were allowed to play the piano like that. Classical piano, it's all about beautiful tone and touch and nuance. And he's playing in this, with this almost just ferocious abandon. And I didn't know what it was called back then. It was like stride piano in the New Orleans style, Professor Longhair, all that stuff. But I just remember leaving that concert thinking, I want to find out more about this. So, I didn't know any jazz artists. UT had a kind of a small jazz department at that point. Jazz wasn't so established in, at the collegiate or university level as it is now. So I just went to the music library at UT and just started checking out books about jazz. And luckily they had good ones there. Books like Arthur Taylor's Notes and Tones, Gene Lee's Meet Me at Jim and Andy's, Len Lyon's Conversations with the Great Pianists. So I just started listening to whatever these people that they were mentioning in the books. And then around that time, the jazz piano professor at UT gave a faculty recital. So I went, and I was like, oh wow, that's really, I love this stuff. And he also offered the next semester. This was either the fall or the spring semester of my senior year. I was almost done with my undergraduate in classical piano performance. He offered an intro to jazz piano class. So a bunch of us jazz pianists took it. And I remember it was really fun, although I felt for the piano teacher, because there are all these classical pianists who are so, well, I'll speak for myself. I was so uptight and so tense and totally unable to swing. And, but I did the best I could. And then after that class, this must have been the fall semester, because after that class, I think all of the classical pianists were like, oh, that was fun. And so that was it for them. But I started hassling him to give me lessons, private lessons. And he was a little skeptical at first. I was like, who are you? But he finally relented, and he is a great teacher. He knew that playing the notes weren't going to be a problem for me. It was going to be this music, which has a totally different aesthetic, different feel, different approach to music. and of course, learning how to improvise. So this didn't happen overnight. I think this is something that's still happening, but I really feel like jazz music was my musical and personal emancipation, because jazz music is an art form that demands you answer the question, who are you and what do you have to say and what do you want to say through this music? And that's terrifying because, the way the culture, the heritage I'd come from did not value that, did not promote that. And then the training I had stifled any, it was like, it's my way or the highway, and nothing have you'd have to say is of any value. So that was a terrifying question to confront and to have to grapple with. But I'm so glad I did, because, you know, jazz music is just as profound, just as an incredible art form as classical music. It requires the same amount of dedication. I think it requires musicians to be even more skilled and well-rounded, because you have to understand the the nuts and bolts of music at a very, very basic level. Because, when I was a classical pianist, I was like, I'm the pianist. I play the music that the composers wrote. People like Bach and Beethoven and etc. But in jazz, you're composing music in the moment on stage. That's really what's happening. So you have to understand form, rhythm, melody, harmony, all that stuff, and then this language, because jazz is a musical language. And so, um, yeah, so jazz music is how I escaped or found my way, found the way that was right for me. Let's put it that way.
Um, we'll talk more about, I guess, your jazz epiphany and everything that came after it. But I want to backtrack a little bit. You mentioned, your parents and the influence they had in the undergraduate school you went to. So, growing up, what kind of expectations did they have of you then? Especially since you still were very involved with music, they seemed supportive of what you were doing. Um, what was their, I guess, end goal for you, or their end vision um, for your life or your career?
Well, you know, I think there's that stereotype that every Asian kid took piano and violin lessons, and my parents didn't really have any big aspirations in terms of like you got to be the big competition winner or become for I think they really just thought this was something that I might enjoy spending my time doing, giving me something to do. And so I'm very grateful for that, because I used to be really upset that they didn't support my decision to be a musician. My dad for years would send me newspaper or magazine clippings about people who were music majors in college but went on to be very successful doctors or lawyers or businessmen or whatever it was. But to be immigrants twice. They were both born in China, then went to Taiwan during the Communist Revolution, and then to come to the U.S. That's not easy. I asked my dad, "What did you do when you know, came back from Ohio?" And he was like, "Well, we just had to check into a hotel and I had to go to work." And to work so hard and to give me and my siblings a life where we could take music lessons. That's incredible gift, and I'm so grateful for that. But I think they just wanted me to have a job that would be stable and something that would be able to sustain me, or just something practical, stable, and enough to sustain oneself. We didn't know any artists. We didn't know anybody who didn't work for a company. So, and I think it was around I was finishing middle school, and I just remember thinking that music is something I would never be bored with. It's something will never get to the end of. jazz music got me in a way that classical never did. But I remember, well, classical music, I seem to be pretty good at it. People tell me that I'm good enough to make a living. So, that's why, I thought maybe this is something I should explore, because I've had the same typical, probably for many Asian American kids, I had to get straight A's. I had to, you know, not get in trouble or, all that stuff. But I think my parents just wanted to know that I'd be okay, like I suppose any parent. Um, but so yeah, so I really had no one to really know how this works, because I remember everybody telling me that you're gonna you're gonna teach mainly, you're gonna teach and maybe do some performances. And I remember thinking, I don't, first of all, I don't know if I like teaching. I don't want. I'm practicing so many hours every day. I really want to play, and so it's funny. I just say life is just you just make these choices every day, and suddenly I found myself over here, but that turned out to be where I needed to be. So I feel really lucky.
Going back to your, your undergraduate music education, it seems you were very gung ho about music, actually throughout all of your educational career. But did you ever branch out of music during your undergraduate studies? And, if so, what else, were you interested in?
Well, I was pretty boring. I mean, I liked sports since I was from Houston, was a fan of all the Houston teams. People think it's funny that I like sports now when they say, "Oh, you actually know how football works" and stuff. But in terms of trying other things, I'm not really. I remember in high school I really loved chemistry, but I think partly because the teacher was so amazing. Um, yeah, but in terms of really studying something else, I guess the only other thing that could come close, I was raised in the church, so I was very active in church activities and stuff like that, but it was pretty much all music.
Um, can you tell me a bit about what came after your undergraduate studies? So you kind of touched on it a little earlier, but you were part of the inaugural class of the Thelonious Monk Institute. So can you tell us more about that, and I guess some of your other experiences that came more directly after?
Sure. So I got my undergrad in classical piano at UT, and then I didn't feel confident enough to apply for a master's in jazz or to start a master's in jazz, but I didn't want to do another undergrad degree because my parents would have flipped out. When I told them I really wanted to study jazz, my dad was like, "What?" Like, I think he yelled at me for like 3 hours. And I don't blame him. Like, this probably seemed to come from left field for them, and they, for them, classical music, at least they had a frame of reference for that. But jazz. So even though he made me apply for master's programs at other schools, I think I went to audition at Eastman and Peabody and Yale. I don't remember. I really wanted to stay at UT and keep studying jazz because I felt like, I really liked the teacher. I liked the program. It felt like, it was still a small program, so there weren't that many students. So I was being made to do things I probably wasn't ready to do, like play with the jazz big band and play in small groups. But they needed pianists, so I actually ended up staying at UT. I did a master's first in classical piano, though. I did a master's in another classical degree, but then took all the jazz classes they had to offer. They didn't offer a master's in jazz anyway, but I took everything they had. And then I was kind of not sure what I wanted to do. People said you should go to New York. I didn't know if I was ready for something like that. I still really had been only playing for like maybe 2.5 years. So my dad, of course, was like, okay, you you have to apply for a DMA, which was the last thing I wanted to do. I did not want to do a DMA, and it's just called Doctor of Musical Arts. It's the musical equivalent of a PhD. I didn't want to do another classical degree, but to placate him, I sent off for these brochures from different schools, and one of them was a New England Conservatory. And when I opened up the envelope, it was like 3 lines announcing the brand new Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz Performance at New England Conservatory. It was a full scholarship, but they only accepted one student from each instrument. So I know my chances of getting in are like 0. But I decided to apply anyway, and I still can't believe they accepted me. You know, I feel so grateful because it really was a life-changing experience. The thrust of that program was to teach jazz in a school setting the way it had been taught up until then, which was, they would call it on the streets, master to apprentice. You know, jazz was not welcome in the schools for very long. In fact, if they heard you play jazz, they'd kick you out or threaten you with expulsion. So we didn't have any classes like traditional. It was a 2-year diploma program. Um, there was only one class we had to take, and the rest of the time was spent with the jazz masters, a very special generation of musicians who unfortunately so many have passed on. They were part of the history of this music, had a hand in creating it, had a hand in being a part of just really pivotal moments. People like Clark Terry, Jackie McLean, Jimmy Heath, Barry Harris. Ron Carter, the bassist, was the artistic director of the program. It was just unbelievable. I mean, these people were on my CDs. We got to tour with Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter. It's just mind-blowing, because learning jazz is not just technical information. It's being around the master, spending time with them. They were so generous with themselves. They tell us all these stories, the history, and they loved the music so much. They loved us enough to tell us the truth, even though, sometimes it would make us cry a little bit, because they really wanted us to get it. Because, something they all said was, you need to know the history of this music. You need to understand the tradition, but we want you to move the music forward in your own way. That was, what they wanted for us and how they taught us. So that really put me on the path I'm on today. And I know I would be a very different musician if I didn't have that experience, because just to have contact with those people, it's like being able to, like if you're a classical musician, being able to study directly with Bach or Beethoven or Debussy. I mean, it's just incredible. And it was hard. I worked so hard. I continue to work hard because, like I said, jazz is totally different than classical music in so many ways. And I knew from the beginning, because of just how incredible this art form is, where it comes from, the story, its history. Just, I wanted to really play it authentically, genuine, really be able to swing, improvise, know the language, not fake it because I could play the notes. But in jazz, it's how you play the notes, and also it's so different from classical, in that as a classical pianist, it's such a solitary art form. It's you by yourself in the practice room, you by yourself on the stage. But with jazz, you're making music together with people, and that's something that I still have to remember when you're on stage. It's like giving up that control and learning how to be in musical conversation. That takes a lot of courage, I think, and vulnerability, and being open to people who don't hear music the same way you do, who don't feel it the same way you do, and then having to come together and make something beautiful on the spot. But that's the awesome thing about jazz. I remember Jimmy Heath, great tenor saxophonist, something he would say. He had so many great sayings, but he said for him, the jazz bandstand for him is the ideal of what democracy should be, because everybody comes prepared. You understand your role, you did your homework, you are able to fulfill your responsibilities to the band. Everybody gets a moment to shine in their solos, to say their piece, but in the end, together you are able to create something even greater. So yeah.
It's wonderful to hear, I guess, how, profound that experience was for you. Um, and I'd now like to move on to more of your, I guess, recent works. So, in 2021, you were a Guggenheim Fellow. So can you tell me about your Guggenheim Fellowship project, Jazz Portraits?
Sure. So that's a good segue because it's related to the Monk Institute. So, I do some teaching now, and I feel like the landscape students are facing currently is challenging in some ways. When I was a student, there wasn't YouTube, there wasn't iTunes and all this stuff. So it's just this. I remember, for us, finding albums or going to the CDs, Tower Records and flipping through CDs and exchanging recordings. And, that was like, it was almost like a treasure hunt for knowledge. And I think when you have to search for stuff like that, you know things in a different way than now, where everything, anything you imaginable that you could want is available at your fingertips. So students, I feel like they have this incredible volume, but just it's not very deep, and also there's not a sense of connection to the past. There's not a value for it. So these jazz portraits are musical portraits of these jazz masters that I learned from. And it's in a big band format, something that's still rather new. I've mostly written and played in small ensembles, quartet, quintet, so that's a huge challenge. But I applied for the Guggenheim in 2020 during the pandemic, and I remember wanting to do a project that would involve a lot of people. Although I was like, what was I thinking? But just that sense of community, which we are starting to get back, which has been such a amazing experience after being isolated in our Zoom windows and live streaming from our homes for like a good better part of a year and a half. So yeah, I want to have at least 5 movements. I'm about halfway through now, and I'm excited. I'm actually going to be doing a concert in Houston in September, hopefully where some of this music will be played. That's one of my goals for the project, and also to play it in New York City, and then I want to record it. So
Very exciting that you'll be playing in Houston. Speaking of, community, the pandemic, um, it goes without saying that the pandemic has brought, challenges on all aspects of society. But for you specifically, what sort of challenges did it bring to your artistry, your work and, your performances? You mentioned, isolation earlier. Um,
I think it was first was the shock of seeing all my gigs get canceled, like gradually over the whole 2020. Everything was postponed or canceled outright, and that was really uh, devastating because we don't clock in and clock out every day. We work from home. We go on the road, and to just that come to a crashing halt, like it was really. I remember thinking, am I ever going to play music with people again? When we didn't know what was going to happen. So I think it was more the mental, emotional, psychological anguish that time put on us. Like I actually, looking back, I mean, a lot happened for me during 2020 and 2021, but it didn't feel like, because I remember a lot of people at the beginning saying, "Oh, Helen, this is so great. You're going to have so much time and you're going to, write so much music. I'm really looking forward. You're going to have so much creativity." And I remember thinking, "Oh my God, I don't know if I'm going to survive this. The last thing I feel like doing is writing music and being inspiring." But I guess, in retrospect, it sure seemed like I did. I released 2 albums in 2021, my first LP, and then the album Quartet Plus. Then the Guggenheim happened, and a lot of other grant projects. I did a digital residency for Chamber of Music America called uh, Reorientation Asian American Artists Out Loud. I've been doing these jazz and neuroscience programs. So, if anything, I'm grateful for the time looking back, even though it sucked. I hated, I hated not going on the road and stuff, but just having the time to really practice, even though I didn't feel like I was practicing at the time because I was like, oh, this sucks. But I was still, practicing because when you're going on the road, having to do running from this to that, it's hard to have continuity in terms of your thoughts and how you what you're working on. So that's something I want to hold on to because it's starting to get crazy again. I was talking to my friends like, is this how we used to live before the pandemic? And they're like, yeah, probably even more. So yeah, so it didn't feel great going through it. I wish I had slept more instead of stayed up, you know, just morbidly like what's gonna happen. But I think definitely just really holding on to the lessons of just it's really important to rest and stop, and guard time because otherwise, I mean, it's already mid-May. I can't believe it. This year is just like, so yeah, it was definitely a tough time, but thank God for silver linings, or it's good comes with the bad, I guess.
For your digital residency, reorientation, Asian American Artists Out Loud. I've watched various of the clips that you sent me with regards to the residency. I think you did a wonderful job, especially with regards to that kind of how you mesh together, various, Asian American artists, beyond the realm of like jazz, like hip hop, into the piece of work. So I'd like to hear in your own words how you thought this residency would combat the rise of anti-Asian sentiment.
Yes, because that was very much in the news when I applied for this residency, because we could do, on any topic that we chose. And I think that's one of the main hopes I had was just to show, because I feel like the way Asians in general have been portrayed in popular media or whatever, popular culture, has been so narrow. I mean, it's definitely changed a whole bunch, but I'm still not satisfied with a lot of it because I feel so much of it co-ops black culture, which I don't I admire and love so all of it, right? But I feel like Asians, it's like we're this convenient minority when we need to be, and then other times we're not considered a minority. I remember I served on a panel for this jazz symposium, Jazz Congress in New York City, and I don't know why this decision was made, but an African American was not on the panel. It was all woman panel, and people became very upset, rightly so. But I remember a comment, someone saying, I don't appreciate that there weren't any women of color on this panel. And I was like, I don't identify as white, I'm Asian American. So it's like I feel like we're in this very strange place, stuck between the obvious black and white, and then also just I think it's partly from our culture too, because it's what I spoke about earlier about not making waves, just put your head down, do your thing. So it's like almost kind of, we don't really have a voice because we've never really looked for one, maybe, or saw the need, or maybe it didn't, I don't know. But what I would love is to see what is an Asian American voice in the arts, or what's an Asian American expression? Because if you ask me, I wouldn't, it would always be like, well, okay, maybe a copy of this, we co-opt that, but just something. And I think that's something that's going to take time and it's going to take effort. And so part of bringing in non-musicians or people from other disciplines, I wanted to show just the cool things Asian Americans are doing that would not first come to mind. Like the artist Amanda Pungbotipakia, just amazing. She's so brilliant. Like she's painting these monolithic murals all over the country, and just the different things she's done combining her background in neuroscience and dance, and it's just stunning what she's doing. And then the poet, Serena Yang, she was New York City's youth poet laureate. And I mean, when you think Asian American, I don't think poet would come to mind at top of list either. And then rapper, Hee Sun Lee, just each of them had such fascinating stories in their journey, and I just wanted to showcase that. I said, look, see, we do all sorts of things, and we do it really well. And just to show, just not this, we're straight A students and we whatever comes after that, we're good doctors, good business people, I don't know, just, and also just, and as a starting point too for conversation, like these I think I said it maybe in the beginning of the video, like this is my meditation on, what is it to be Asian American. And I don't know, we're exploring this. We definitely have points of commonality in our stories, as I interviewed all of them, but we also have very different things too, and that's all part of it. Just wanting to build up this tapestry of Asian Americanness, I guess.
Yeah, as Asian Americans, we're kind of caught in the middle, in a sense. And I think it's great that you're trying to, or really expressing the heterogeneity in the Asian American experience. Like you said, we're not all, I don't know, like straight A students, like good doctors, um, you know, um, and, would producing works like these, I guess, with a um, kind of conceptual focus on combating, anti-Asian sentiment or expressing this heterogeneity in experience, is this something that you would want to continue to pursue in the future?
Oh yeah, definitely, because it's starting to change in jazz too. Like I'm often the only woman, and then Asian American woman. Like what? And I think it's just this whole. When I was younger, the word was Oriental. They would use, right? Because I remember growing up. I don't know how I did not consider myself Chinese. If I had to really unpack it, I was like, well, I identify with being American, and that would mean if I really drilled down, with meant being white. And there's that, um, I don't know if you've heard it, just that our elders would call us, oh, you're bananas, like you're yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And it wasn't until I started performing more in Asia where I felt like I was coming to grips with, no, actually, I am Chinese. I am American, but I am Chinese too. And I remember there's a wonderful music festival in Taiwan, in the city where my parents grew up, actually, Taichung, called the Taichung International Jazz Festival. And the first time I played there was as part of another band, and I was looking in the program, and they said, I don't know, I'm mistaken for Korean a lot. And I mean, even walking down the street, Korean people will come and start speaking to me in Korean. In the program, I said Korean American pianist Helen Sung, and I went to one of the organizers of the festival. I'm like, who put this? I'm not Korean. And then I said, I'm Chinese. My parents grew up in Taiwan, and I remember there were some young Taiwanese jazz musicians, and when they were like, what? You're one of us. And I felt this embrace that I was not expecting and was so amazed and moved by, So, I feel like I'm myself figuring it out, what does it mean to own being Asian American, being Chinese? Because I think it has to start with us, right? Because then owning that will come after that, I think will come with just certain expectations of how we want to be treated, how we want to be portrayed, how we want to interact, which is, I think, important. And also just, that they what they call us, the model minority. I would say it's more like we're the silent minority, and I don't want to be silent anymore. And I really think artists, and not just in so many ways, I think have always led the way. Not that I'm like, oh great, I want to lead this, but I think what the arts do, it brings people together, it makes people face each other, it makes you face yourself. It's the very nature of the thing. Maybe that's why artists are some often on the forefront of unpleasant things. Because we were just talking about, what were we talking about? Oh, I was visiting a friend in New Jersey, and she was just talking about this part of New Jersey that used to be incredibly run down until the artists came and made it really cool and this artsy, and now all the rich people are moving in because now it's not, it's like it's same thing happened in the city of Detroit. They were paying artists to move there. So yeah, that's an interesting phenomenon. But I think, this is a journey that I'm on too, and I'm always excited to meet people who, like those three ladies that were part of the residency, like, yeah, you're doing your part too, and cheering them on.
Um, so I'd like to go back to, I guess, some of your other work. And can you tell me a bit about your most recent release, Quartet Plus, um, and the polymerization between, classical and jazz music you encompass within the album?
Yeah, thanks. Um, that project was kind of always something I wanted to do, to write for strings. I wasn't sure how or what, but I play the violin too, and I would love to incorporate that sound. So I applied for this grant. It's called the New York City Women's Fund, where they give grants to women to create works, musicians, filmmakers, visual artists. And in March of 2020, right before everything shut down, they told me that I got one. And I applied with this project, with this idea of my quartet and a string quartet. And the string quartet, I've been wanting to work with them for a while. I met them when we both performed together with somebody else's project. And I just remember, because I'm really picky about how I want strings to sound in jazz, because it's so easy, in my opinion, for strings to sound hokey or cheesy if it's, because of the string sound and just how the bowing works and the rhythmic everything. And they're called the Harlem Quartet, and they're from New York City. And I remember when I first heard them, I was like, oh, they really get it. So since this grant was all about empowering women, I came up with the idea of like, well, let's just do music all by women. And that was an incredible experience because, so many great women in jazz over history. They've written so much great music, and I didn't know any of it, because I was so busy learning the standards, and most of the records, everything's by men. So this was really a fun and neat opportunity. And so it ended up being half my songs and half songs by other women, uh, incredible pioneers in this music, Mary Lou Williams, Jerry Allen, Toshiko Akiyoshi, Marian McPartland, and Carla Bley. And we record, I'd never, because it was a grant, it had to be done by a certain time. So I've never recorded and released an album in the same year within a matter of months. It was so crazy. We recorded it in April of 2021. I mixed it in May, mastered it in June, sent it to the record label in July, and it came out in September. And it's been so fun playing the music, getting to share. I'm playing my first AAPI Jazz Festival later this month at the Rutgers University Jazz Institute. Um, I toured California with this project in March. Actually, in November of last year, I got to play the full version in Poland. There's this amazing festival there. They have an amazing string quartet that plays jazz. And so we collaborated for that concert. So I hope to do a lot more of that. And one of my hopes is to be able to bring it to different schools because a lot of universities have resident string quartets. Because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to bring the two worlds together, jazz and classical, and just you know, I hope to encourage some classical students to get over the if they have any, fear or misgivings, and just invite them into this amazing world, learning how to improvise and trying different styles of music, and just because I feel like most of my artistic life has been about bringing those two sides together. Um, so yeah, thanks for asking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of you mentioning that in the future you'd also like to um, bring more of that polymerization. Um, so speaking of that, do you have any future works in progress then, besides your fellowship project, um, related to that polymerization or just future works in general?
Well, something I really want to do. I feel like I want to do a solo piano record, although that scares me to death. But another area of interest I have is in 2019, I was the first jazz artist in residence at Columbia University's Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute, and that's their flagship neuroscience research department. And that was an amazing experience. They wanted to include artists in the dialogue about the brain. They have a visual artist in residence and a writer in residence. So I got to meet with these amazing neuroscientists, Nobel Prize winning scientists, and just learning how amazing the brain is. I mean, just lifting my hand like this, the processes in the brain that go into doing something as simple as that are not even that well understood, let alone let's go many more steps to music, because music is so special in the way how it engages the brain in a really comprehensive manner, like few other activities. Um, and so also, I became interested in music and as it helps people with memory impairment issues, because I have folks in my family who have been touched, unfortunately, by things like dementia and Alzheimer's, and music therapy has been around for a long time, but just the music in this way for Alzheimer's and dementia people, it can really bring people back to themselves. It's amazing. There are videos I watched because I met this scientist at the Zuckerman Institute whose previous research was all in memory. She told me about this guy, I forgot his name. He's a conductor, and somehow he had a brain, I think it was encephalitis or something, where he lost short-term memory. He can't remember anything from one day to the next, but he remembers how to conduct. He remembers the music, and there were other people who were unfortunately at a very advanced stage and were unresponsive. But when they listened to music from their youth, it like woke them up. They remembered the lyrics. They remembered who they were. I mean, it was incredibly moving. And so I started this collaboration with the Zuckerman Institute and the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. The scientist I mentioned, she found an organization in New York City called Arts and Minds, who help folks with these issues. But they only did visual arts experiences. They would take them to museums and they'd look at pictures and do drawing activities. So we asked them, do you want a musical component? They were like, of course. And it's been so amazing. We did, as part of my residency, one program just for them. This was in 2019, and one program for the general public where I was paired with a scientist, and we talked about the neuroscience behind how we appreciate and listen to music, some aspect of it. And so in 2020, when all my gigs were gone, I reached out to them and I said, hey, would you like to continue this? So we've been doing, I think they go for about 4 or 5 month stretches where we do a monthly program focusing on rhythm and how the brain deals with that, or the sense of just memory, or just any different topics like call and response, or how we listen, and just the how does the brain process sound waves into I mean, it's just fascinating. So I want to, in the end, I learned like how we experience the world is really electronic firing signals between neurons. So it's all electricity. So I want to go from one extreme, which is complete acoustic, to completely an electronic project where I'm playing keyboards and doing um, synths and sounds with, and a project called, I call it Jazz Plasticity, which is about the plasticity of the brain and how amazing that is. They used to think that over a certain time our brains just became what it was, but it's not true. Like we can learn till the end of our days, and that just again underscores, because I did a program end of last month with a scientist who studies social memory, where she studies mice and how they form. She puts them into these artificial societies of four, and they gradually figure out who's the most dominant. She has different tests, and they form these little societies. And how does that happen? They have to have memories of the other mouse and who they are to the mouse. And so we studied that in terms of just, our lives generally every day are improvisations. We react to, we respond to, we learn from, we investigate, we inquire, we observe, and just it's just amazing what our brains enable us to do. It's incredible.
Very, very, very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah. Um, in addition to being jazz musician and composer, you've also been on the faculties of, various schools such as Berkeley, um, Columbia, I think. And are you still on the faculty at any of these schools, or any schools for that matter?
Yeah, I did 3 years at Berkeley, and the commute almost killed me. That was, it was good training, because I feel like the more I teach, the better I become at it. Um, I did 3 years at Juilliard, and now, yes, I'm still at Columbia. I teach lessons, and what I enjoy most is doing stuff like visiting artist residencies and master classes. I did that this year at Western Michigan University, University of Texas at Austin. I went to my alma mater. Went to my alma mater, and yeah. So that's mainly the bulk of my teaching right now.
You mentioned earlier in the interview, um, about how you weren't sure if you wanted to teach in the future. So I'm curious to hear what motivated you to join the faculty and, teach.
Well, they asked me to. Well, you know, I think for me personally, it's good to have a range of things to do. You know, like I don't only want to play my own music. I like playing other people's music too, because I get sick of myself, and it's good to have perspectives, different perspectives, right? Because none of us see it all, and my mother always says teaching is a way of giving back, and she's right. Like even though I'm still so uh, reticent about really just, I think teaching, like I said earlier, it's a huge responsibility, because you have the life of a student in your hands, of a young person. So yeah, I like that I'm getting better at it, you know, and and I think it also helps me realize, oh my gosh, I need to practice that too. Yeah.
More on the topic of education. You've also been, or you've produced, I think, a Jazz Week program.
Oh yeah.
So tell me more about that program.
That was also made possible by a Chamber Music America grant. It was I identified this school. It's called Urban Promise in Camden, New Jersey, which they collect students that don't are not able to function well in a traditional school setting. People who guess, suspended or maybe just have issues, and they bring them into this special environment. And really, it's amazing the work that they do because they're not only teaching them school stuff, they're enabling them to become successful at being a part of society. And I think it's K through, I don't know, yeah, it's all the way through high school. But I think we only, I don't, this was a while ago. I know we at least we went through like from second grade through eighth grade, and so I wanted to design like a really holistic experience of jazz because I wanted them to, um, and the faculty there is wonderful. So they helped me design this program where there was an artistic component to it, where they learned about artists associated with the jazz era, with jazz, like Romare Bearden and his style, and investigating that style, and then making um, uh, their own artworks in that style. And then also musically, they had students choreograph. They choreographed a dance to jazz music. They also had instruments. I brought my quartet, and we played with the student instrumentalists. We also arranged songs for them to sing that we played with them. So it was like a big extravaganza. It was like a whole week. Like we went there and worked with them each day, taught them a little bit about the history of jazz, and rehearsed. And at the end of the week, we gave a big concert where all the families came. It was so much work, but it really was an amazing experience. And I hope some of them, went on to at least listen to jazz and or even play an instrument. And it was funny, we asked students to write their uh, thoughts about them, and one of them was like, I don't really like jazz, but I love how honest kids are, but I like the saxophone player because he looked cool or something like that. So yeah, because I think any chance you can give young people exposure to music, to jazz, to the arts is so important for their whole lives, because the arts are so special because the arts encompass everything, math, science, history, it's all in there, and it teaches you things that I think not many other things can.
Yes, absolutely. Um, are you currently involved with, any other, music education efforts or programs?
Yeah, I do a lot for Jazz at Lincoln Center. They have various initiatives all over the country. They have something called Jazz St. Louis, which I've done master classes and rehearsed coached their student combos. Um, I've taught at something they call Have Swing University, which is for adults, where teach on different topics. I do summer jazz workshops, all over the country, at different jazz academies, short things in the summer. So, yeah, um, and then yeah, that's mainly I think the other educational activities that I do.
I'd like to now move on to some of your um, some details about your family, and also, I guess, growing up in identity and heritage to end our interview. Um, so the first question I have is, you know, um, we've talked about your parents a bit throughout the interview, um, and would you say, how would you describe your relationship with them now that you're, an accomplished composer, musician?
Well, I'm still their daughter. I don't think they really understand what I do. Like I don't think they can understand how much it means to me and what it means to me, but I think they're just happy that they see that I'm happy doing what I do and that I'm doing okay, not on the streets, able to make a living. And so that I think that's enough for me, you know. Um, so whenever I'm in Houston, I make them come to the shows, and I think they enjoy it. That they've come to see some different shows, and yeah. I think they've accepted it.
Do you, oh, well, you did mention that you have siblings, the oldest. You're the oldest. What do they do? Um,
Okay, yeah, no, they're all much more traditional and very impressive. Um, sister, she's a molecular biologist at Sloan Kettering in New York doing, I think she was doing cancer research. I'm not sure what research she's doing now. And my brother made a lot of money on Wall Street. He's a Wall Street guy. And then my youngest sister, my parents finally got their wish. She's an anesthesiologist. So yeah, it's so funny because a few like not that long ago, a friend of mine said, "You know, Helen, I think you were the black sheep of your family." And I was like, "What?" Because I always thought of myself as so dutiful and obedient, and but I was like, I guess if you think of it that way, I set a bad example by going against our parents' wishes. But like I said, I think I'm glad it all worked out because I think if uh, I probably would be a very different and probably very unhappy person if I was doing something else right now.
Worked out it did. And how would you describe your relationship with, your siblings?
Uh, it's like it has its ups and downs. It's like any family. It's tough things. I think I sometimes feel like an alien in terms of just because my life is so different than theirs. Like there's so much about my life they don't know or understand or how it all works. Because a musician, like, it's so hard to differentiate life from work because your life flows into your work. Work is not something you can really leave behind, it's always with you. And so it's like this I'm always working. Whereas they're like, well, you don't have to go to an office, so why can't you just go? you know, I mean, although I do get some flexibility, I can make that choice, but it's not like I can just make it. There's always work to do, and this all-consuming kind of thing that the arts really requires. It's really, I think it's made me go different places, meaning the kind of questions I ask myself, the kind of things I think about, the kind of things I'm grappling with, I think is most places that most people would rather not go. Just because it's messy, it's scary, it's dark, it's unknown, but I think that's what the arts thrives on. I think thinking back to why artists lead the way and certain just because we go to those dark places because we have to.
You mentioned earlier that when you were a kid, when you thought about your identity, you would be, American, the best.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Um,
didn't want to be Chinese, although I couldn't hide it. Yeah.
so, what about now? I guess, as an adult, after um, your experience in the world, what do you identify yourself as? And do you think those, I guess, those demarcations of like Asian American, do they really matter in the end?
I think it does because for me, I don't think the point is that we're all, I think differences are not a bad thing. It's only when people use differences as a means to put someone else down or to marginalize them or discriminate against them. I think differences are awesome because I wouldn't want everybody to be the same. I mean, even if you're, I mean, I remember when I would visit or have when I was playing in Japan or playing in Taiwan or China, and I'd be sitting on the train and I look like everybody else. But even then, it's just I think differences. It's it's something to appreciate and something to really enjoy, you know. And also, I consider myself Chinese American, and I really want to find out more about Chinese things. And what I mean by that is, you know, my parents were immigrants twice. I think when you're immigrants, that involves laws because I really don't know much about my grandparents. I met them only a couple of times. And my great grandparents, I know nothing at all. And part of that is because my parents don't know their grandparents either because they were left behind in China. And I remember when I saw Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and I was looking at all these animals, those strange animals, and I forgot the name of the this magical city, but there. Remember that thing that didn't have a face with the wings? Did you see that movie? Okay, it's
I
the
did.
creature that Ben Kingsley played, that kind of a jerk, the guy who was like pretending to be the the Mandalorian. Oh no, no, not, I'm mixing things up. Pretending to be the, what was his name? I'm forgetting all these things. But there was this creature that looked like a dog, but it had no head. It had no face, but it had two sets of wings. And I remember, what is that? And I just searched for it online. It's called a huanduan, not like wonton. It was another word, but it's like from the Chinese creation myth of the Chinese creation myth comes from something called the primordial egg, and there's this chaos around it, and that creature is part of that chaos. And I couldn't wait to ask my parents about it. But when I asked them about it, they didn't know what I was talking about. And that made me so sad, you know, because it's like they're themselves are cut off from, you know, from various things like religion. They were proselytized by Baptist missionaries in Taiwan, and it's so sad that religion like that just says, oh, all that stuff is not right or it's not worth knowing. I think all that stuff is worth knowing. I think how different cultures see the world or how they explain the world, that's, it's all good. It's all beautiful. So I, you know, I want to learn more about that. I want to, again, it's a journey, right? I don't have the answer. I don't have like the final answer, but it's just, I'm interested in that. Maybe I could write a, I don't know, an opera about it. Who knows, you know? Just because that is part of my people's history and heritage and tradition, and I don't know anything. And it goes way back thousands of years, right? Which is amazing. So, yeah.
I have one more question about jazz.
Okay.
So, you know, you performed in, various countries. You know, jazz is a diverse genre. And you know, speaking of like differences, would you say that jazz is like a quintessentially American genre? And have you ever thought about, like fusion of different cultures within jazz? You know, has jazz gone global? Um, I guess this is a slew of questions I have, but yeah.
Well, for me, jazz began as an African American expression art form. You know, is an expression of their experience in America, which unfortunately really sucked for the first 400 years. It was beyond terrible. So when they were set free, you know, I think part of their grappling with this newfound freedom and in this music, you know, I think the fact that something so beautiful could come from such hell, I think really speaks just as a testament to the strength of their people, their, you know, um, I think the imperatives, like I mentioned earlier, what Jimmy Heath said about the true democracy on stage, I think it's was very important that basically they were silenced for hundreds of years. They were not treated like people. So now, like I think in their arts and their music, it was very important that everybody in the band have the chance to express solo, right? To speak their piece, to play, to shine, to be seen, to be heard. So I think all that goes into, just for me, jazz is such an incredibly strong art form. You know, it's influenced every I think I want to just make this distinction. It is African American, and African American is part of America. So yes, it's one of the only native art forms to arise from this continent. Um, it's incredibly strong. It's influenced every form of popular music in this country, as far as I'm concerned. And yet, and also the world. You know, it's global, as you said. Also, jazz can take in any number of influences. You know, you think about the Brazilian influence. I know people who play flamenco jazz and the Middle Eastern thing, in Indian, and yet, you know, you think about the fusion of different things like jazz fusion, you know, all that stuff. But jazz, somehow, it doesn't lose its core identity. I don't think there are many musics you can say that about. And I think, to me, that again is just a testament to where it came from. It's an incredibly generous art form, and it welcomes everybody who wants to partake and be a part of it. And I think that again reflects just, you know, this people who had been enslaved and um, just wanting to just rejoice. You know, jazz has its roots in the Black church, gospel, just that expression of just joy and life affirming, just all that amazing stuff. That, to me, that's so part of the heart of jazz. And um, yeah, I'm just so grateful to that it made a place for me in this music, and that's what I hope to share through my music wherever I'm playing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, before we close off the interview, I'd just like to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to share or add that perhaps wasn't covered in this interview?
Um, I just hope people. I think it's too bad. I think right now, because of just the way our society is, because a friend of mine, we were talking about this the other day. I feel like jazz has a image problem in America, meaning that people seem to think that jazz is this very intellectual uh, art form that they don't understand and that they won't enjoy if they don't understand what's going on stage. And so I just want to tell people, you know, at its heart, jazz is a musical conversation. It's a musical conversation between the artists on stage, and it's a musical conversation with people in the audience. It's a communal experience, celebration, and um, all we need is for you to just listen, you know. And it doesn't mean you might not understand how to improvise over a 2-5-1 progression, but that's not the important thing. It's just to know that it's jazz is music being made up in the moment. You know, like you and I are having this conversation. We didn't plan what we were going to say beforehand, right? But we're able to communicate because we know the same language with its vocabulary and grammar and conventions. And so and that's what jazz is, but we do it with music. And the special thing is the audience is part of that beautiful experience. So I just hope, if somebody was thinking, should I go hear that jazz concert? I would say, yes, please do.
Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much, again, for, you're very busy, for taking the time out of your day to, share your oral history with us, provide us with some very important perspectives on, culture, especially with regards to Asian Americans. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. Great to meet you, and good luck with everything that you're doing. And I look forward to seeing the final video.